distinguished guests. I'm very honored to be here and to give some of my thoughts about the strategic situation in South Asia using the example of the Cold War, which I have studied very extensively. I think the situation in South Asia is very interesting just from an academic point of view, because the consensus in the academic community is that states that have nuclear weapons don't go to war with each other, and that generally nuclear weapons have a war-preventing capacity. And what appears to have happened in South Asia, at least in the early years of the world nuclearization, is that the opposite has happened, and that conflicts have, in a way, become smaller perhaps, but more frequent. So this raises a sort of very serious question whether nuclear weapons at some point or other might actually be used. Now, what I'm going to do is look a little bit at military doctrine and nuclear thought on both sides to gain a greater understanding about how the role of nuclear weapons is conceptualized. And in particular, if we look at the academic and expert literature on nuclear threats, deterrence, and force postures, this was largely developed in the context of the Cold War confrontation between the Soviet Union and the United States and their respective European allies. And therefore it's not surprising that many Pakistani and Indian military experts are looking at the concepts and strategies developed during that time. So in order to understand this a little bit more clearly, I'm going to talk a little bit about the analysis of NATO nuclear policy during the Cold War period. And I should say that I have studied, of course, this very extensively using declassified documents as well as secondary literature. Now, I think if you look at this very closely, we see that the analytical concepts that have been developed shows that there are important misconceptions and false analogues, and that the factors that gave rise to strategic stability during the Cold War in the East-West conflict are largely absent in South Asia. Now, I'm going to summarize them briefly as follows. First of all, the persistent conflict between two protagonists that emerged after World War II did not involve a direct territorial dispute between them, although there were territorial disputes at the periphery of the Cold War system. Secondly, the heartlands of the two protagonists were separated by very considerable geographical distances. There was little prospect of either the protagonists being subject to a direct military invasion by the other, and any military conflict was likely to be carried on the territory of the Allies unless it escalated to the level of an exchange of long-range strategic nuclear weapons. In other words, the two protagonists operated from very substantial strategic depth, which is absent in South Asia. Thirdly, the development of very substantial strategic arsenals on both sides that involved significant second strike capabilities enabled deterrence to be developed to the point of mutually assured destruction. The development of very sophisticated early warning systems became another essential component of strategic stability. Now, I would like to develop the history just a little bit further, because I think what's interesting is that one of the issues that we're looking at in South Asia is the relationship between the strategic balance and the nuclear balance and the conventional imbalance. Now, there was a conventional imbalance during the Cold War period in Europe. This is quite a complex subject because, on the one hand, there was a conventional imbalance looking at the peacetime deployments of Soviet and NATO forces, and on the other hand, the more important imbalance related to the fact that the United States thought there would be a very serious force deficiency 30 days after mobilization in the event of a war. And what happened was obviously that the United States then sought to counter this imbalance by the deployment of large numbers of tactical nuclear weapons in Central Europe. But I think the important thing to bear in mind is obviously that if we take the global strategic balance, the United States was more powerful than the Soviet Union in many respects, both in terms of its economy and in terms of its global military capabilities. And the strategic capabilities reached a kind of saturation point. In terms of the development of nuclear capabilities, both countries went through similar kinds of, talking about Soviet Union and the United States, went through a similar kind of learning curve, if you like, because in the early years of the nuclear age, the very sharp distinction between nuclear weapons and conventional weapons didn't exist. I mean, nuclear weapons were just more powerful weapons. So the idea that nuclear weapons are a different category of kind of weapons came a little bit later. And we see both in the United States and the Soviet Union in the early years a very strong reliance on nuclear weapons and an increase in the nuclear arsenals, and then we see the Eisenhower administration substituting nuclear capabilities for the lack of conventional capabilities in Europe through what was called the New Look in the 1950s. What happens then gradually was that the United States wanted to create what was called a nuclear threshold, so that any war in Europe wouldn't automatically lead to nuclear escalations through a strategy that came to be known as flexible response. Now, the problem with flexible response was that it was not universally agreed upon in the 1960s, when especially the Germans wanted to have a commitment to very early nuclear use in order to deter any kind of Soviet aggression against Western Europe. This, however, changed by the end of the 1960s. There was a consensus of flexible response, and the idea that nuclear weapons should only be used as a last resort in the event of an attack from the Warsaw Pact that could no longer be contained by conventional forces. Now again, from the United States point of view, the effort to use tactical nuclear weapons as a form of escalation control were very critical to raise the nuclear threshold to the highest level possible. Now, the central puzzle of the strategic relationship between India and Pakistan has been that many people thought that the acquisition of nuclear weapons and the overt nuclear status did not result in a complete cessation of military conflict between the two sides, even though that is normally taken to be the effect of nuclear weapons. And for this reason, you find that the literature focuses on what is called the stability-instability paradox. The stability-instability paradox was created by Glenn Snyder to explain that even in a situation of nuclear plenty and where two sides have large strategic nuclear arsenals, the conventional military balance does become important, precisely because there is a kind of mutually assured destruction capability at the strategic level. And this explains that in Europe, the possibility of the use of conventional forces by the Soviet Union might be possible because the Soviet Union was deemed to have a superior conventional capability. Now, what's happened in South Asia, though, is very interesting because the appearance is being given that the state that is provoking military clashes in South Asia has been the state that has an inferior conventional capability. Now, the lack of strategic depth obviously means that the distinction between tactical and strategic nuclear forces is less relevant. There is no potential battlefield for a limited war that does not involve the territories of the main protagonists. This also means there's very little strategic space for escalation control, and in the time of military confrontation there's a temptation to escalate due to the virtual absence of tactical warning. Another key difference is that while the Warsaw Pact enjoyed a superiority both in the peacetime deployments of conventional forces in Central Europe and potentially in the early phases of mobilization in the lead-up to armed conflict, overall the capabilities of both sides were balanced and equivalent. And this is not necessarily the case in South Asia. Both sides in the Cold War possessed a surplus of strategic capabilities for mutually assured destruction, whereas in South Asia the strategic capabilities are more limited on both sides. So whereas in Central Europe the Soviet Union enjoyed a temporary advantage, in South Asia it is unclear what the balance of power would be in the initial phase of an armed conflict. And overall, however, there's a very substantial imbalance between the two sides, as India enjoys a substantial edge in the size of the landmass, the size of population, its economic capacity, and its conventional military capacity. India has adopted a no first use policy, while Pakistan has refused to adopt such a posture, and instead has developed battlefield weapons to deter an Indian attack with the threat of the potential first use of nuclear weapons. This is in many respects the inverse of the stability-instability paradox as generally discussed in the literature. The fundamental principle of the stability-instability paradox is that the nuclear strategic balance reduces the effectiveness of nuclear deterrence against conventional aggression, and that the side with superior conventional forces could therefore risk at least limited aggression, even though both sides have nuclear arsenals. But in South Asia, this would imply that India would conduct conventional attacks against Pakistan, but the Indians obviously would claim that in the various conflicts since the nuclear tests, it was the Pakistani side that initiated conflict. Now there is an interesting question, because the way in which Pakistan is deploying, or at least developing tactical nuclear forces, there seems to be a belief in some way that India would be deterred from using its nuclear weapons even if Pakistan initiated nuclear use. This presumes an asymmetry of deterrence, namely that India is more robustly deterred than Pakistan, despite the fact that India has advantages both in nuclear and conventional capabilities. The belief that India would be deterred by the possible use of nuclear weapons and therefore be restrained in its response to low-level military confrontations was encouraged by the experience of the regional conflicts since the nuclear tests, especially brass tacks and the Kargil crisis. A closer analysis reveals, I think, that in the brass tack crisis, nuclear weapons did restrain India's response, but it was not the case in the Kargil crisis. Now, I understand this is controversial, so I think that's open to debate, obviously. The Indians believe that the Kargil crisis was not a nuclear crisis at all. The involvement of the United States in compelling Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif to end the crisis did to some extent confirm the Pakistani view that if a crisis escalated risks of nuclear conflict, it would compel a great power to intervene. But this intervention was not in Pakistan's favor, and therefore did not confirm that Pakistan could achieve gains in its conflict with India by taking nuclear risks in the hope of external intervention. As long as the protracted conflict in India and Pakistan endures and remains frozen by the nuclear balance, violent clashes and severe regional crises will recur that involve very significant risks, as provocative behavior, including the use of armed force, even by proxy fighters, could result in unintended escalation and the use of nuclear weapons, especially if one side is committed to nuclear use under certain conditions. So the risks are exacerbated by the deployment of tactical nuclear weapons and, if it exists, the pre-delegation of authority of use during a crisis. So the conclusion that I draw from this is that some of the lessons that have been learned apparently from the Cold War era are not perhaps the correct lessons, and that strategic stability in South Asia is far more difficult to achieve, partly because of the nature of the underlying conflict, partly because of the structure of the nuclear arsenals, partly because of the sheer proximity of the two protagonists, which make any nuclear use really a strategic use rather than a tactical use. And so I am concluding simply by the fact that strategic stability in South Asia is still relatively fragile, and therefore new ways might have to be found to enhance strategic stability, and that will require a deep dialogue between India and Pakistan. Thank you.